Well, good afternoon, hello, and welcome to today's A-Team Group webinar on new solutions to the old problems of compliance with communications surveillance regulation. My name is Mike O'Hara. I'm a contributing editor at A-Team Group, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's webinar. And I'm delighted to welcome our expert panel, Darren Sir, Global Head of Surveillance at BNY Mellon Markets, Eric Young, Senior Managing Director at Guidepost Solutions, and Paul Cotty, Director, Global Markets Compliance Advisory at NICE Systems. Good afternoon, gents. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves in a moment, but before we do, just some information for our audience on how you can take part in today's webinar. To the right of the video, you'll see a box for questions and for polls. We'll be running 3 polls during the webinar today, so please do vote. That helps us to gauge industry opinion, and I'll remind you all of when the polls are coming up. If you would like to ask the panelists any questions, we will be looking at questions from the audience throughout the webinar, and we'll be aiming to address as many of them as possible towards the end. So please feel free to ask your question or to add your question to the box under the questions tab. So without further ado, let me hand over to our speakers to introduce themselves. Paul, I'll start with you. Could you give us a quick intro of who you are and what your interest is in?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, my name is Paul Cotty. My accent betrays me as Australian, but I live in New York City. I'm a director in the product team at NICE Actimize, as Mike said, and my job is to liaise with our customers and regulators and others in the industry to find out where the winds are blowing and what we need to do to make sure that our customers have got what they need. My background, I kicked off as a trader, then spent some time as a compliance officer moving into surveillance. So I've been there and done that, hopefully, and then moved into the vendor space about 8 years ago.
Great, thank you, Paul. Darren, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. My name is Darren Sir. I work at BNY Mellon Markets. I run surveillance globally for the markets division. I've been at BNY 3 years, and prior to that, I was at the FCA, where I worked for 4.5 years in the market surveillance team. In my prior life, similar to Paul, I was also a trader. So I've sort of flipped from various different roles, and now I'm on the surveillance side. So looking forward to a good discussion, and yeah, let's get some lively debate.
Excellent, thank you. And Eric.
To A-Team for inviting us for our discussion this morning. I am with Guidepost Solutions, which is the global monitoring, compliance, and investigative firm. I started my career with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and spent most of my career as a chief compliance officer with JP Morgan, 4 foreign banks, including UBS and BNP Paribas. The large French bank. I teach ethics and compliance at Fordham Law, and very happy to be here.
Great, thanks, Eric. Well, thank you all for those intros. Eric, I can start with you. If you could maybe set the scene for us in terms of, what you see as the key regulatory requirements around communications surveillance. Why you think they're frequently breached, and what kind of penalties firms face for non-compliance?
Well, we've seen recent penalties in the press over the last year and a half with respect to the large global banks, often the same banks that have been in trouble over the years with respect to trading and sales activities, misconduct, market abuse, and it's all connected. But at the end of the day, with respect to this discussion, it's about record keeping, supervision around the failure to supervise, whether within a broker-dealer or an advisory firm, and most recently about monitoring communications on top of trading and other activities in which activities and communications were done on personal devices, WhatsApp and other similar messaging means. So one, was it COVID, or did some of these activities actually occur before, and were lessons learned based on the misconduct and violations over the years in which communications and record keeping are critical.
Okay, Paul, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Eric touched on a really good point, and it's something that we're all talking about. In my discussions recently with banks and regulators and at conferences and so on, everyone's talking about the personal device side and how hard that is. Just going back to your question, the regulatory requirements, at least in I think in the US and the UK and Europe, they're pretty clear. And a lot of other jurisdictions as well, but let's concentrate on those two. The fines that we saw in starting in December, that slew of fines between December of last year and September of this year were pretty clear. The SEC and the CFTC, in their notices, they pointed exactly to what the regulations were. They made the point in at least one of those notices, one of those fine notices, that they found these infractions or these holes in the record keeping requirements through audits and through audits and on-site inspections of that itself. They weren't looking at necessarily looking at something that arose out of the course of a manipulation investigation. And I think that's really telling. They're actually digging in on those or pointing to those specific regulations rather than just as an add-on.
Mm-hmm.
And I will actually go back further. I mean, the fines that we saw, as I say, in December, I'll just call them the 2022 fines from now on. Those fines that we saw were not the first ones. I did some digging after September, and the regulators were fining people for record keeping lapses going back into 2011, 2006. And it's some of the same names kept on cropping up, but those fines tended to be fairly low level. I won't say they're frequently breached, but they did, sometimes regulators seem to go in and they'd be looking for something else or doing some sort of investigation into a dodgy trade, and they'd find some, some piece of the record that was missing, and they'd sort of, strict liability on the back of that. And they just add that to the fine. Whereas these ones were, I think, the biggest that we've seen and the most notable for specific strict liability breaches of record keeping requirements. And it's also the follow-on. It's not just failing to keep the record itself, it's what you then can't do because you don't have the record. So, we saw 17A4 breach, you haven't kept the record. Therefore, you can't fulfill your requirement to produce the record if need be. So you get these flow-ons. I think, why they frequently breached was part of your question as well. Yep. I would direct people to Commissioner Goldsmith Romero's concurrence from the CFTC when these fines came out. It's a page and a half of blistering reading. It's an absolute hairdryer held up to the management of the banks. And she says tone from the top. I hate to say it, why are they frequently breached? Because the tone from the top hasn't been settled, hasn't been strong enough to comply with these rules. I'm just going to digress slightly, and go off piste here. The SEC's got a bit of a movement on at the moment with respect to record keeping, because they've also proposed some rules to move away from worm to software-based retention. I know I'm going a bit off piste here, guys, and I do apologise, but I think this is, the record keeping is clearly, they've had enough. Enough's enough, and I think they want to, right, guys, this is you've got to pull your socks up on this. Sorry, I've dominated the conversation so far, so I'll go back on mute.
Okay, no worries. We'll come back to the worm versus software-based a little bit further on in the discussion, I think, when we talk about technology. But I'd just like to bring you in briefly, Darren, before we go on to our first poll. I mean, would you agree that these these regulatory requirements are frequently breached, and would you agree with Paul's assessment that it's the tone from the top that is the main reason for that?
I think the second part of that question is easier to answer than the first one there, Mike. So yeah, I mean, tone from the top is very key, actually. And I thought one of the fines was really interesting in that it seemed one of the initial fines, and I'm sure everyone will know which bank I'm referring to, but senior level managers had been attesting to not using non-compliant software when communicating, and then we're actually doing so. So if you have that that sort of example, it goes to the point that Eric made around supervision and tone from the top. You know, that has to be in place. And I think that's why the regulators have started handing out these fines, because banks really should know better. You know, we've been through LIBOR, we've been through FX.
Exactly.
The messages are clear. And I think, Eric, you made a good point. You know, it all comes back to very similar sort of nexus as to, you know, these whole aspects. Banks have to understand that it's the tone and it's the culture, and they're very hard to actually embed within the business, very hard to teach as well. You know, you can't just buy a good culture. It doesn't happen like that. You have to breed it. But clearly, you know, if people, and you will always have bad actors, we know that. Unfortunately, that's why we'll all still be in jobs, hopefully, in the next 10 years. But you know, you can do your best. You can obviously try and put in place all the right technology, set the tone as you see it, and then obviously try and make sure that everyone has the tools and the capability to do that. But people can obviously pick up a mobile phone these days, especially in the COVID and sort of hybrid working model that we've all gone back to. And so the regulators are being very clear in what their expectations are. And it's really important that banks actually take notice of that.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to maybe introduce our first audience poll here. And the poll question for the audience is, what are the key problems that can lead to breaches of communications surveillance regulation? And it's a multiple answer poll, this one, so please click on as many as you think are appropriate. And the options are too many different user devices, too many comms platforms, working from home or hybrid working, lack of internal control, and misuse of comms devices. Now, while the audience is answering that poll, Darren, I'd like to maybe continue in the theme that you're just talking about then, and look at, you know, what you see as some of the kind of initial steps that firms can take to avoid breaches and the penalties of non-compliance. And you kind of mentioned a few there, but I mean, what would be a good starting point?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, actually. I mean, obviously, some of these fines that we're seeing at the moment are related to historic activity, and clearly we can't address those failings. We can't go back in time. So really now it's about trying to be proactive and self-disclosing if you can. It might be too late for a lot of people, because obviously, you know, once the door's been knocked on, it's a bit too late to sort of self-disclose. But, you know, a lot of firms are now, and this is speaking to peers, looking at what they can do in terms of transaction testing. So that's something that we're putting in place, where we're actually trying to check that we have that full record from the moment the order is received to the point at which it's been executed and fed back to the client. Do we have all the steps in the chain? So putting in place sort of, it's a tactical solution on top of what we're already doing. Obviously, we're going through the motions, which I'm sure everybody connected to the industry is, where, you know, you're upgrading your lexicons, you're looking at all the processes that you have in place. But it is very difficult because, as I say, you know, and your poll question leads to it as well, there is a large number of devices that traders or people that should be being monitored have at their disposal. And interestingly as well, I find that, you know, we do an annual test of all our platforms that are being used. You know, over the course of a year, a platform may introduce new technology such as a chat functionality piece of add-on to the software. And because a trader might have that on his or her desk, they will assume that that's been approved to use. So there are some instances like that. So for me, being in my seat, you know, it's very much a case of what can we do to enhance the controls that we have, and then think about it more further to further our thinking, so that we can actually demonstrate that we're being proactive. And I think for all the banks now that are in a, you know, sort of position where they're thinking about what they can do, it's trying to make sure that they're reading the fine notices and trying to learn from that. And I think obviously we've talked about culture and tone from the top, but trying to embed that, trying to get that message replayed by the CEOs and the COO team to make trading teams realize that. Yeah,
interesting point you make there, actually, that you know, traders might think because something's on their desktop it's compliant. You know,
yeah, good point. Yeah,
not necessarily the case. Eric, have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Usually when something goes wrong, the question is, where was audit? Where was compliance? Because record keeping and these rules, particularly around sales practices and trading, have been around forever. And some of these firms, if they've been subject to the FX or LIBOR requirements, heighten the expectations and the audit trails by audit and by compliance. And then finally, whether it's a reputation risk committee or just new process approval, the use of personal devices, which is not uniformly applied, by the way, or prohibited. I found that one region, it's industry practice, but also client expectation. And it is a challenge on the trading floor or elsewhere as to whether to prohibit or not. And of course, employees have raised and pushed back on whether they can or should on the one hand, and then whether they should surrender their personal phones on the other hand. So it's a multifaceted challenge, but then again, that's what audit compliance as third and second line are supposed to be used to. Finally, there's a lot of cost cutting and pressure for the first line to take over the first stab beyond supervision to self-monitor and cut the second line and rely on the periodic testing of audit. So there's a lot of moving parts, but this is part of the reason why we are where we are. Regulators and plaintiffs see one monolithic name or institution. That's the challenge, because if you lift the hood, there's a lot of moving parts, legal entities and jurisdictions.
Yeah. And it's interesting that, if we look at the results that have come through from the poll, I think they would kind of echo what you've both been saying there, that the key, one of the biggest key problems that can lead to breaches of communications surveillance regulation is too many comms platforms, followed very closely behind by lack of internal control. And interesting that working from home or hybrid working has a much kind of smaller impact from at least
that is interesting.
Our webinar attendees. What are your thoughts on those poll results?
Could I jump in there? Yeah, sorry to butt in, but I'm just thinking with one thing that's been sort of going around in my mind. I remember my first compliance job was at a buy side firm, and we were thinking of bringing in a ban on mobile devices on the floor, and we decided against it simply on the basis that we thought it would be too hard to police, and also from the point of view that hey, it's the 20th century. People have mobile phones, and if someone's got a kid at school who falls over and hurts himself, then it's going to probably be the mobile number that the school calls. So you can't stop people living their external lives as well. So we decided to try and work with the team, with the floor, and say, righto, we're going to allow you this, but there will be no, it's black and white. We're going to give you a simple rule: no business communications whatsoever on your personal devices. And I just think that maybe trying to capture everything, all these different platforms that are coming out. I mean, the FCA put out, was it Market 68 or 69? Darren, help me out here, where they were talking about all the multitude of fixed income trading platforms that have sprung up, and people running, trading platforms out of their garage and so on. And it was a struggle for, the FCA went round and found that the compliance departments were struggling to be able to keep up. And someone sets up a new trading platform and they speak to a trader at a bank. Oh yeah, I'll take this on, just download the app and away you go. And I think some banks took the view, no, you must only deal through approved channels. If we say it's okay, then it's okay. Unless you have explicit approval to deal with a channel, it's unapproved. And I think that sometimes you have to be black and white like that and say, right, we're going to give you, there's been this whole, bring your own device. And I think after the pandemic kicked in, banks obviously couldn't roll out issued devices very quickly. So they had to rely on BYOD, but I think that hump has passed now. If I was running a bank trading floor, I'm not going to tell anyone how to do their job, but I would be giving people, a work device. Here's your work device. Do not use your personal device. for any business communication whatsoever, or communication with any business related party whatsoever. And it's very black and white. And I think that sometimes you need to be simple and clear in that respect. Maybe that's where we're going to go.
It's quite hard though, Paul, really. So, we're doing a lot of work around, should people get a second device, or do we use bring your own device? And there's a few sort of important factors on that. So obviously, if the phone is required to be handed in for inspection, you've got a lot of privacy aspects around that. So obviously, on a
BYOD basis,
of course, it's my own personal data. It's not in my contract currently that I will hand that over upon request, but obviously if it's subpoenaed, you've got to. So, a lot of firms now, and I shouldn't really, obviously, I should say the views that I'm expressing are my own and not those of BNY Mellon, but obviously read into it what you were. So, thinking about upgrading contracts, people's personal contracts, to say, well, look, if I demand your phone, you will hand it to me for inspection. That's all sort of coming into play. Now, the other point of that is some people don't want to actually carry two phones. It gets complicated. You end up leaving one behind. A lot of people will have the sort of contacts anyway on their own device, and that sort of has led to this problem. So sometimes, getting a second device doesn't really solve for it. And the other point I just wanted to make quickly as well is around phones on the trading floor. So we've been sort of having this divergence of opinion since going back into the hybrid model, because previously phones were banned, but now everyone's saying, but if I'm working from home, my phone's on my desk anyway, and you wouldn't know that. So why can't I have my phone? Plus, two-factor authentication is becoming a real feature on quite a lot of platforms at the moment. So most traders actually need to have the phone for even some of their own devices that we have within our company. So it's sort of, there's a few sort of interesting factors around the personal device. And I'm interested to know if what other people are sort of thinking about that, yourself and Eric.
Well, regulators at the end of the day will always ask, okay, if this requirement cannot be met this way, what is your compensating control? Because to Paul's point, absolutely, it's not a silver bullet or a simple answer. People have good reason to use or not use their own personal device, depending on the circumstance. But then the question still falls back to the institution as to, okay, what is your compensating control? Is it documented and then prove to me that it's working? So yes, there's exceptions, but the question is, does the exception become the rule? And I think that's in part what's gotten some of these firms in trouble. And I think we talked about this earlier, this is probably the first round. We don't know yet what other firms, which other firms are being investigated, and will probably be dinged as well.
Just make a list and sort it, and then start going down. I think, Eric. I just go on the phone thing. I mean, I guess from the BYOD side, Darren, going back to, I think it was you said earlier on, that sometimes things, software applications and so on, or unified communications applications can get upgraded and add features that you don't know about initially. I guess my concern is that can happen on a phone as well. If there's BYOD, and there could be interaction that I don't know about, or my bank doesn't know about, between a personal application and something that's behind the firewall. And if I maybe just go to get a pop-up to phone wants to access your contacts or something, and I just hit OK, bingo, suddenly there's a privacy issue there. And if I'm handing my phone over for a check, a BYOD phone over to you for a check, I have to give you access to that phone. So I have to give you my password to it, and bingo, suddenly you've got access to all my emails and all my chat history. That might be fine. I mean, there's the age-old problem that someone who's going to do insider dealing, if a trader's going to do insider dealing, the last place they're going to talk about it is on a work phone. They're going to do it, on a burner phone, or having a cigarette outside, or in the pub or something. You were probably part of Operation Tabanula when that was going on. So maybe having access to people's personal devices might actually have to become part of the contract in the future. I'm also going to take, with respect, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with what you said about people carrying two phones and that becoming a burden. back when I started trading in the 90s, very early 90s, people would, it was really seen as a point of glamour if you'd go down to the pub and you had your pocket watch, your Tele-Rate pocket watch. It was a kind of, oh, look, I'm a trader, So I'm not sure that that's necessarally so. I mean, people didn't have mobile phones at that point, or if they did, they were those big brick things.
Brick, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It seems funny people would be complaining about it when you
so carrying two little phones
right.
is. But I take your point.
Yeah.
I do take your point. But if that's part of the job, and if you have to go out during trading hours and be contactable, then that's maybe quid pro quo. But anyway, I'll leave it there.
They're thorny issues, aren't they? I mean, I guess there's no kind of clear answer to any of this, or no clear approach that one is better than the other in terms of BYOD or two phones or whatever. It seems that some organisations obviously will go down one route and others will go down another route. But Eric, did you? I saw you had your hand up earlier. Was that?
Yep.
Did you want to make a point there?
Yeah, first I was holding two phones, but also the point I want to add is we can't forget as well, because we've spent most of the time so far on the surveillance beyond work phones and desktops, and firms still have trouble. I think, or still are getting in trouble for the ability to monitor multiple front office source systems feeding into a data lake to have integrity around, work systems, work communications in a bona fide way. And then on top of it, keeping up with the backlog, hopefully none, of alerts to investigate and ultimately determine whether there's either fraud or some type of suspicious activity on the trading side. So I think we can't forget that, yes, BYOD is today's issue, but we have to get the blocking and tackling, as some of us like to say, of the basic tools and work processes that also need to be tightly controlled.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, actually. Mike, I'm just going to say, it's a good point Eric made there, actually, where, and this was definitely exacerbated by COVID, where all of a sudden, we're presented with everyone having to work from home, suddenly needing to install these communication platforms to allow collaboration amongst teams and then also with the clients. Some of them are feeding into captured archiving systems in terms of the messaging, but maybe not the voice. And so, because people are seeing it on their desktop, they're assuming that they can use it. And it's a lot of education that's required to say, well, okay, for example, you can use this platform because everything is captured from it, but you can only use this one for non-business related conversations. But for everything else, you have to switch to a recorded line or a platform that's monitored. So it becomes quite hard. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I just wanted to, with all of this kind of data from multiple communications mechanisms feeding into these data lakes and so on that you mentioned, Eric. One of the things that you mentioned there was alerts, and I'd be interested to explore the whole topic around kind of alert management, responses to alerts and so on. What kind of technologies, techniques, solutions, best practices there are around, ensuring that you get alerted to any potential breach and are able to respond without too many false alerts, false positives. What are your thoughts on that, Eric? It's a bit of a convoluted question. Sorry.
No, not at all. It's a complex challenge. It's a very complex challenge because it's trying to correlate and find patterns of communications, which is unstructured oftentimes because of the multiple sources of feeds, hopefully feeds, and then trying to correlate it with trade surveillance and other activities that might have nothing to do with trading, but very much to do with fraud or outside the institution because of collusive activities with buddies from other firms that either work together in legacy form or just work well together in less ethical ways than they should be. So one, it's not just a point in time, it's looking for patterns and having the algorithms, and Paul, I'm sure, has a lot to say on this, is what do those patterns really mean, and are the rules appropriate so that you don't have too many false positives, as we see on AML and sanctions, to flag, follow through, and ultimately have a documented decision that there is suspicion or illegality going on in a timely way.
Paul?
Yeah, false positive. I'll be, brutally honest. Ever since my first day as a surveillance officer back in 2009, the false positives have been the bane of a surveillance officer's life. And for all our customers out there, you'll have to trust me on this. We try every day, every single day, false positives comes up in conversation and how to mitigate. And it's a nut that's very difficult to crack. I always took the view I actually welcome a few false positives. And keep in mind, actually, when we talk about false positives, we need to be clear here, because a false positive, like in a medical sense, is where there's a problem. We've all taken, COVID tests over the last couple of years, and a false positive would be, just so we're getting the definitions clear here, a false positive would be where the test returns a result saying that you have actually got the illness, but in fact you don't. There's a problem with the test itself, and for whatever reason, you might have not done it correctly or whatever, and it returns a positive where there shouldn't be one. Now, what happens? I think people conflate that with where there is actually a correct alert triggered, but it's actually nothing. And what I mean by that is, you've fed the data into the rules engine. The rules engine is actually correct. It's been checked and all the rest of it. So we know that the logic, the triggering logic works, and you get an alert out of it. Now, it might be that alert actually, the business activity or the activity that generated that alert is actually fine. It's cool, but because of where the thresholds were set, it generated the alert, okay? And we often think of that as being a false positive. A lot of that will come down to where you set your thresholds. And as I say, as a surveillance officer myself, when I was a surveillance officer, I would often welcome a few false positives, because it meant it was a check. I knew that the alert was actually working, the data was working correctly. Obviously, I didn't want 10,000 alerts, but a few I was perfectly happy with. Moreover, I also got to know some customers, that this is an algo trading shop. They have, a small number of accounts that they deal, the actual pipes they come to us with, or through us to the exchange. And behind that, they've got 500 different sub accounts. So actually, I know that I'm pretty comfortable that most of what they're doing is okay. It just so happens that two of those accounts that are actually separate happen to come down the same pipe. Bang, they hit each other. Wash trade alert, for example. So again, I knew that thing was working. It actually also worked as a sort of a negative indicator, because if I suddenly or over time saw a drop off in the number of alerts from that particular actor or that particular trader, that in itself allowed me to ask a question. So there was this mental profiling or pattern building in my mind. And that was 2009. Obviously, the world has moved on in 13 years, and we are trying to electronify my thought processes in that respect. And this is where a bit of AI comes in. We are taking an incremental approach to AI, keeping in mind, again, the FCA has made clear that you can't just have a black box and press the button and walk away and go to lunch. Explainability remains a big key thing, and you need to be able to explain why a particular alert generated. But going to the voice side that Eric mentioned, again, we are finding difficulties here, but it's not just, it's more, as Darren said, it's more than just improving lexicons. I mean, I'm involved in projects whereby, I'll have our Japanese speakers and our Italian speakers, and we're trying to figure out how, and then translating, English, London, Cockney slang for the FX market. And so in a single sentence, you can have multiple languages. As I say, I'm working on a project where we're taking, UK London-based slang, and we're working with a bank, say in Italy, but has activities in Japan as well, and trying to figure out all those. I speak a little bit of Italian, but certainly no Japanese, and so we're working with with translators and experts in those languages. But it's far more nuanced and involved than just the first cut of, oh, why don't you just improve your lexicons? It goes far further than that.
Yeah. We've got another poll that I'd like to move on to. Darren, before we do, I mean, do you have any quick thoughts around kind of alerts, false positives, and so on?
I just laughed actually when Paul said that about false positives, because you're right. The second we're not getting false positives, I'm saying to everyone, what's wrong? What's happened to the system? Is it broken? So it's always good. It's good to have that check and balance. And you're right. Obviously in periods of volatility, you want to get more, but they're non-issues rather than false positives, and that's sort of how we distinguish. But yeah, that was my point there, Mike.
When you said you had to laugh then, Darren, I was just laughing at me.
No, I'm not laughing at you. I just the bane of everyone's life.
Yeah, no, it's nice to know that some of the issues and sort of thought processes that I had 13 years ago are still valid. So
yeah, but on the voice as well, the issue that we often get challenged with is, obviously, if you're translating from a native to an English, or are you trying to basically monitor in the foreign language? So that's always that's a difficult challenge, because you lose nuance. And that conversation that you described there, which could involve, obviously we live in a hugely geographical world, and that's a great thing. But from a voice surveillance perspective, that's quite a difficult thing, because, most people will speak another language, or words in another language, or everyday speak now. Just we'll throw in different bits of slang and different bits of foreign.
And there's dialect as well. So just one very quick point on that. I was
Glaswegian, for example, is
indeed,
accents.
Exactly.
But I was dealing with a bank in Belgium recently, and they, even in counting, if, for example, in French, the word for 80 is 80, 420s, whereas in Belgium, I think it was, and some other other francophone countries, they use 80 or 90 or 70, which is almost a direct translation of 70 and 80 and 90. Which a French person will be aghast at, but you're picking up those little dialectical things can also be interesting.
Yeah,
I'm just going to make 2 quick points. One, in terms of lexicon, I was at a firm where we would look for the word sue, as in litigation, and every time there was an email or a reference to a person named Sue, it kept coming up. But more importantly, regulators, at least in the US, are expecting these rules and tools to be considered quote unquote models that need to be independently reviewed and validated by risk management and ultimately signed off, which otherwise becomes a red flag. So one, do you adjust the rules so that you have less alerts, because we can't afford all the people to go through the alerts to investigate or escalate them? And as Darren said, are they set too low because of that, or are they set too high, which you just keep let it pile up? So a second line risk management increasingly is being expected to validate independently these tools and rules.
Great. Okay. Well, we've got another poll up here, and it's around the benefits of implementing emerging comms surveillance solutions at your organisation. So, what would you expect those benefits to be? And it's a multiple answer poll. So, significantly improved regulatory compliance, better internal-external communication, faster and more complete alert investigations, reduced operational costs, greater productivity, new business opportunities, or no benefits, or maybe all of them. So
all the above.
Yeah,
all of the above. Yeah.
So while our audience are answering that poll, Paul, I'll come back to you, and if we, maybe focus for a little bit around emerging solutions, and if you can maybe just talk us through what you see as being some of the main kind of operational and business benefits around some of these emerging surveillance.
I think a very brief mention was made earlier on by one of my colleagues, didn't quite catch who, but about being able to match things up. And I guess that's where we think the future lies. We use the word holistic surveillance, and I know that a few years ago that word was being bandied around the traps, and I think there's a slightly different meaning to it now. And so we mean it in terms of front to back. So, if I look at the regulation, if I look at MAR and MIFID, helpfully, I think it's Article 16 in both of them talk about surveillance. And this goes back to what Darren was talking about before. I think transaction checking. Darren, when you brought that up, I thought, we're going old school again. Are we going back to some sampling here, which is which haven't been seen for a while. Yeah. But we're trying to, I guess, automate that process to an extent and say, okay, well, we've got the trade surveillance. We can pick up and let's talk about nice, easy world of exchange traded instruments to start with. If we've got trade data set, and we marry it up with what comes from the exchange, so we've got a full set of the orders and trades flow. So we know what's happening, and it's very well timestamped, very accurately timestamped. Well, guess what? We've got all these communications on the other side, which are also very well timestamped. So it's actually not that intellectually difficult to match the two up. And if you know who the subjects are, you know that, okay, a particular client or trader or whatever, you can identify them in the trade data, and you can also identify them in the comms data. It starts to, we talk about unstructured data and the difficulties with that and so on, but actually it narrows down where you have to look for the bodies to be buried. I guess you're automatically limiting the size of the problem, and then you go in and say, okay, what's going on. So if you generate, at the moment, we're quite comfortable in generating a trade surveillance alert and then bringing in the comms on the back of that. And we also have, I'm being a bit salesman here, but the other way around, we can also generate alerts out of the comms side. The next plank is to you've got your thresholds on both of those. But what about a situation where, and maybe this is the holy grail, or the next holy grail, where you could actually lower the thresholds on the trade surveillance side, but only trigger an alert if there's something or that also causes suspicion on the comm surveillance side. So by marrying the two up, you're able to have more dynamic and perhaps lower thresholds, so those alerts might be more meaningful. That's where, that's the sort of stuff we're working on at the moment. As I say, we can generate trades and back it up, trade surveillance alerts, and back that up with comms very happily. We do it all day, every day. Likewise, we can do it the other way around. We generate a comms surveillance alert and then enrich that with the with the trade information. It's what you can do when you bring the two together that I think, as I say, it's something that we're actively working on at the moment.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what whether our audience agree with you on some of that, Paul. We've got the webinar. Sorry, the not a webinar.
Poll.
The poll. Thank you. Lost my words then. The poll results are in. The main benefits of people seeing as being significantly improved regulatory compliance, which is, I guess, not a shock.
Not a surprise.
Yeah, and faster and more complete alert investigations. Interestingly, there's been more responses around no benefits than there has to new business opportunities. And I'd be interested to get your insights on this, Darren, because I mean, I've run kind of roundtables and webinars in the past where people have spoken at length about the new business opportunities that could be generated from having the right kind of surveillance systems in place that can collect all the data, throw it in a data lake, and then be able to kind of analyze and do NLP and all that kind of stuff on that data. So there could be, that could drive insights that could lead to new business. But I guess nobody here in our audience is seeing that as a reality. Maybe that's just sales speak. I don't know. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on these poll results, Darren?
So actually on the business opportunities. So I do see that actually. So you're right. Over the years, what we've effectively done is look, and every bank is doing this, so it's no trade secret, but you're looking to increase the quality of the data that you have and basically normalize that data. So on the back of that, obviously we're able to give back to the business their own data and say, well, this is how we see margins or profitability and etc. And the business already has this style of information anyway, but we're just looking to try and use the data that we have to provide that enhancement, making sure that clients are being priced correctly. Obviously, I sit in the first line, so that's part of my job anyway. So I do see that as providing any sort of additional data point can only help with that. So that's the benefit that I see. I think in terms of the top answer, significantly improving regulatory compliance, that's obviously key here as well. And obviously the aim that we're all trying to achieve is lower fines or no fines ideally. So I definitely second that one.
If I could add, and these are certainly not mutually exclusive, improved compliance and investigations will lead to better communications and vice versa. One control that's silent, but hopefully included is improved internal controls, because oftentimes it's the senior trader bullying the junior finance or ops in particular, or even compliance person to have their way. And it's through these internal communications, which are just as important, if not more, than the external communications that need to be monitored closely. Because is there a true segregation of duties, for example? Is pricing independent? Is it appropriately marked for swap dealer purposes, as just one simple example? Are the books and records beyond communications, but also the numbers, true and accurate? So I think there's a lot actually into these responses that we could look into.
Great. Thank you.
I think it also, so yeah, thanks, Mike. I think it also comes up, Darren, as an aside, mentioned that he sits in first line. And I wonder, you know, I'm a bit of a purist here, and I think absolutely not. There should be, you know, I prefer to see no data going back from compliance to the business, because I just think I don't want them to know what I'm looking at. I want to be a bit, I want to keep them on their toes. But I guess
it's not the routines. Yeah, it's not. I wouldn't obviously tell the business. I said in the first line, but independent. I wouldn't obviously explain what we're doing, but we just have a wealth of data at our fingertips nowadays.
No, I get that. I understand that. Thanks for clarifying. But I guess what I'm saying is you sit in the first line, so it would be more natural for you to have that relationship. That relationship. Whereas I think if we move to second and certainly third line, I'm kind of like, maybe the data becomes a little more remote. But I'm not at all surprised to see that the first thing about regulatory, the number one answer there about the regulatory responses and making sure we have compliance.
Sadly, it's what's answered doesn't necessarily match the budget in reality.
No.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dajan, I wasn't in my comment there. I wasn't meaning to say that regulatory capture or anything like that. But as you said, it's more just I think the data that you have access to and what you do with that data will depend on where you sit, and therefore a poll like this, we don't know which line everyone sits in. So that's going to affect that's going to skew the results a bit.
So in the interest of time, I'd quite like to put up our third poll, the third and final audience poll. And this is, kind of future looking basically. And the question is, how does your organization expect regulatory requirements for comms surveillance to develop over the next few years? 3 options. There'll be more regulatory requirements. There'll be no changes to the burden of regulatory requirements, like how this question's written, and there'll be less regulatory requirements. So again, while the audience answer that poll, Eric, how do you see regulatory requirements developing over the next few years?
I think depending on the industry, depending on the product or the type of risk, a particular type of communication, which is what we're primarily talking about here, there may be more regulatory requirements. In some instances, as we started off, these are long-standing rules. But ultimately, as we're seeing, it's less about what new rules or amended rules, it's how much more enforcement of these rules will there be. The teeth are much sharper. The resources at the disposal of the SEC, perhaps the CFTC, and we haven't even talked about the bank regulators at this point that have trading activities within their entities. The supervision and enforcement is much greater, and I think that will continue. And if it's criminal, of course, the DOJ and their counterparts globally will weigh in as well, and they've been much tougher.
Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep my answer short because I'd be really interested to hear what Darren, as a former regulator, says about this. But I think that MiFID. Okay, I was a compliance officer when MiFID 1 came in the UK or in the EU, and then MiFID 2 came in several years later. And I know that ESMA has been doing a review into MiFID 2, so we may see some nuances, but I don't think we're going to see any wholesale changes. Article 16 in MiFID 2, for example, is going to pretty much stay the way it is. What I think we've seen is an increase in not necessarily the regulation, but in regulators' expectations, for anyone outside the UK, please, take a look at go back when you get some time, go back and take a look at some of their Market Watch newsletters, because the evolution, they will get on a topic and then 18 months later, they'll revisit it, having set a line out, and then they'll go out and visit a whole bunch of firms, and then they'll put another, an update to that. And we can see that it's very explicit. The rules haven't changed, but their expectations have changed based on the data that they can get their hands on, based on changes in technology, based on changes in market practice and things like that. So I don't think we're going to see new regulations per se. We're just going to see regulators' expectations, and they're very much on top of the technology. People like me go and talk to the regulators and say, hey, look, this is what we can do now. So they know what's possible out there in the market. So that's where I think the changes will come.
Darren?
So if you're getting a hard time, it's not because there's some new regulation out there. It's because the regulators have upped their, continuing to up their game.
Yeah, you're right. Some good points there, actually. And you're right. I don't think it's new regulation per se. And I think, Eric, at the start of the call, you made a good point, because, these record-keeping fines, the regulators and the regulation for that requirement has been there for a long time, so it isn't new. And then, Paul, you made a good point as well. It's about technology from my perspective, and it's my opinion, but I think the regulatory expectation is increasing. They've got new kit, they have new capabilities technologically as well. And I think, if I think about the evolution of surveillance, I think a few years ago it was about putting in place surveillance. And do you have surveillance? Yes, no. And a lot of firms didn't have it. And then it's about, okay, so what types of surveillance do you have? And now I think it's more a question of how effective is your surveillance. So, we talk about false positives, and the regulator doesn't want to go into a firm and see, yes, okay, this firm might have the shiniest tool out of the box, but has it been optimized? Is it working effectively? That's more of a key question nowadays. And for me, when I think about e-coms and voice surveillance, regulation isn't prescriptive. I mean, FINRA obviously sets out more around e-com requirements than any other regulator. But even then, they're not going to tell you how to set your surveillance solutions up. It's for each firm to decide that. But the key thing is making sure it's effective. And I think that's where the focus is now. So making sure, and then in addition, sorry, I'm just going to take one more point. As well as having the surveillance in place, it's what is the firm's ability to demonstrate supervision, and that it's got a view on its traders' activities as well. So I think that sort of goes into the
exactly. And going full circle, it's all about culture of the organization, and regulators are very much talking to each other across the globe. The cultural challenge of these global institutions, and it's almost by definition, is they don't always talk to each other, and the systems certainly don't talk to each other from one region or another. And the question is, how does it all roll up for someone or some group to actually understand and follow through whether there's misconduct or not?
So we'll have a quick look at the results of the poll. No surprises there, I guess. People think there'll be more regulatory requirements. But I'd like to move on to, we've got a couple of audience questions in, and we've got like 5 minutes left to go on the webinar. So it'd be useful if we could maybe have a look at some of these. So the question that's been voted at most, I will put to you now. In today's environment, how are you seeing firms address and action instances of confirmed violations of e-commerce related policies for the specific personnel that violated policy? And what level of tolerance is being accommodated in terms of first time versus repeated violations by the same individual? I don't know if you've got, is there a possibility, Jerry Ann, to maybe pull that question up on screen so that everybody can see it? I don't know. But if not, then we can maybe put it in the chat. So I don't know who would like to address that question first. There we go. There we go. So it's that top one. Who'd like to pick up on that?
It's a good question, actually. So consequence framework is a key topic discussed, I think, at every bank. What do you do for repeated violations? How seriously are violations taken? And interestingly, that again goes to the tone question. How good is the tone from the top? You clearly, if there is a violation, you have to be seen to be taking action, but not because you want to be seen to be taking action, but because actually everyone knows it's the right thing to do. And I think it's quite difficult. Obviously, the action taken has to sort of justify, what the breach was, but then also send a strong message, which is ironically what the regulators are doing now. So I think it ties back to that.
And some of it's structural. Some firms have actual conduct committees to periodically, let's say twice a year, or upon an event, to assess the recidivism of the individual and their boss, and whether there's any reduction in compensation, or are they the star trader or salesperson and they get 10 strikes and you get a raise, so to speak.
You've got to have that independent body reviewing it, definitely, because there'll always be the head trader bias coming in, definitely.
Yeah.
I think, if I might chime in, I wanted to stay away from this one because I thought it'd be better to hear from the practitioners first of all. But I do recall, was it last year or late 2020, where let's just call them an American investment bank dismissed 2 managing directors for having a conversation over WhatsApp, a business-related conversation over WhatsApp. It wasn't related, from memory, it wasn't related to a specific transaction, but the very fact that these 2 managing directors were having this conversation over an unrecorded channel, they were dismissed for it. So in terms of action being taken, that's pretty strong. I think there was another one where it was a continental European investment bank, if memory serves me correctly, where a senior, like a business MD, an investment banking MD or something, was personal friends with a person who happened to be a client. And they were having a non-work related conversation over WhatsApp. It might have been related to, who's going to pick up the kids from school or something. It was that level. But the bank had said, you cannot talk to anyone, have a conversation with any client over these unrecorded channels. And the very fact that the business person had a conversation, even though it was not business related, with a person who happened to be a client, that was also grounds for dismissal. So I think some banks are taking this seriously, and they're trying to be seen to be doing things. Whether that's going too far or whether that got them out of a fine, I'm not sure that it did. But yeah.
Excellent. Okay, well, unfortunately, we're running out of time here with 2 minutes to the hour. So I'm going to ask each of you maybe to just give us some closing thoughts on what any kind of key pieces of advice for practitioners, or any key takeaways you want people to go with. And I'll start with you, Paul, if I may.
I think thanks, Mike. I think that last poll says it all. Regulators, like we were discussing, I don't think they're going to be particularly onerous more regulations, but regulators' expectations are certainly increasing over time. I would direct people to take a look at a fine. I'm not going to mention any bank names, but the FCA levied a fine of a few £1 million mid-year against a bank that for surveillance breaches. And what they were talking about there, what they were hitting on there was things like risk assessments and the structure around surveillance, not just the have you got it, are you doing it, but what are you doing with it, how are you doing it, how do you make sure that it's working properly and that it's suitable for your business. And that last point, suitability for your business, is key. Don't
Yeah.
rely on the defaults out of the box. Do your own assessments and come up with your own numbers.
Excellent, thank you. And Darren?
I'm running out of time, but I agree with all that. I was going to say that it's about effectiveness, Mike. It's making sure that your solutions are effective and tailored to the business. Definitely.
Excellent, excellent. Short and sweet. And Eric?
Real short and sweet. DOJ says, is your compliance program well designed, adequately resourced in terms of budget, including technology and skill sets to address everything we've discussed? But most importantly, be able to prove that it's working. And if there's holes, it's not working.
Yeah, indeed. Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much to all three of you for a really interesting and informative discussion. I hope our audience, I'm sure our audience found it such as well. I certainly learned a lot there. And a special thank you to Nice Systems for sponsoring today's webinar. Thanks for that. Before we close, just a very quick note on a few A-Team webinars that are coming up. We've got three, I think, well, another two webinars coming up this week. One on real-time, where are we? Yeah, real-time multi-stream data processing for trading analytics and risk management. Another one on Thursday around market data in the cloud. We've got the Trading Tech Summit coming up in London in the new year. And you might want to take a look at A-Team Connect, which is our platform that you can use to deliver efficient and interactive events and webinars, and you can download our regulatory data handbook and so on. So a lot of stuff that we've got there. Really appreciate people taking the time to come on today's webinar. Big thanks to Eric, Paul, and Darren for a great discussion. And please do complete our feedback form, because we're always keen to hear people's views. So yeah, gents, thanks again. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
thank you, and goodbye.